Commander Jake Phillips stared at the communication console aboard the UES Defiance as the last signal from Zentara Prime flickered and died. The silence that followed was unlike anything he had experienced in his 20 years of space service. For the first time since humanity had joined the galactic community 112 years ago, the galaxy was completely quiet. Lieutenant Amy Carter looked up from her station with wide eyes. Her fingers moved across the controls with practiced speed as she tried every frequency and every communication protocol known to the Galactic Council. Nothing came back except the cold emptiness of space. The network that had carried billions of voices across thousands of worlds had gone dark in an instant. Amy turned to face Jake with confusion written across her face. She had been monitoring galactic communications for 8 years and had never seen anything like this. Even during the worst conflicts between alien species, there had always been some chatter somewhere in the galaxy. Trade signals from merchant fleets, scientific data from research stations, or simple greeting messages between colonies. Now there was nothing at all. Jake called up the last message on his personal screen and read it again. The words seemed to burn into his mind each time he saw them. The Galactic Council had been the voice of reason and order for over 3,000 years. They had guided younger species through their first steps into space and mediated conflicts that could have destroyed entire star systems. For them to simply announce their departure and cut all contact was unthinkable. The Devourers. Jake had heard whispers about them in the deepest archives of human knowledge. Ancient records spoke of something terrible that lurked beyond the edge of known space. The Elder races never talked about it directly, but there had always been references to a great barrier that protected the galaxy from something unspeakable. Most humans had assumed it was just another alien superstition, or perhaps a reference to some natural phenomenon like a black hole or radiation field. Amy tried the emergency frequencies one more time. These channels were supposed to be kept open even during the worst disasters. Military command frequencies, medical emergency networks, and disaster relief coordinators all remained silent. She expanded her search to include the Outer Rim colonies and the independent trader networks. Still nothing. Captain Helen Ross entered the bridge with quick, determined steps. Her gray hair was pulled back in the same tight regulation style she had worn for 30 years of military service. The crew respected her not just for her rank, but for the way she had led them through the border wars against the Skull Raiders 5 years earlier. She had kept them alive when 3 other ships in their task force had been destroyed. Helen looked at the communication display and immediately understood what the silence meant. She had seen enough battles to recognize when an enemy was more dangerous than anyone had expected. The fact that every advanced civilization in the galaxy had chosen to run rather than fight told her everything she needed to know about what humanity was facing. Jake showed her the message from Zentara Prime. Helen read it twice before speaking. The safe zones mentioned in the transmission were something she had heard about in classified military briefings. They were pocket dimensions that could be created by the most advanced species in the galaxy. The technology required was far beyond anything humans possessed, and could only sustain limited populations for short periods of time. Helen called for a full crew meeting in the main briefing room. Within 10 minutes, every department head on the ship had gathered around the central table. The faces looking back at her represented the best that humanity had to offer. Scientists, engineers, soldiers, and explorers who had dedicated their lives to pushing the boundaries of human knowledge and experience. Dr. Kevin White was the first to speak after Helen explained the situation. As the ship's xenobiologist, he had studied dozens of alien species and had developed close working relationships with researchers from across the galaxy. The idea that all of them had simply abandoned their homes and their life's work was almost impossible for him to accept. Kevin explained what little humanity knew about the Devourers. The information came from fragments of ancient texts and casual references in alien literature. They were described as entities that existed partially outside normal space and time. They consumed not just matter and energy, but something far more fundamental. Consciousness itself seemed to be their preferred food source, Lieutenant Commander Sue Parker from the Security Department asked the obvious question about human defenses. The used Defiance was armed with the latest human weapons technology, but everything they carried had been designed to fight other physical ships and space-based threats. If the Devourers really could exist outside normal space, then conventional weapons might be completely useless against them. Engineer Pete Johnson raised concerns about their fuel and supply situation. They were currently 3 weeks out from the nearest human colony and 6 weeks from Earth. If the alien trading posts and refueling stations had been abandoned, then they might not have enough resources to make it home. The ship could sustain its crew for 2 months on emergency rations, but that assumed they could find water and raw materials for the recycling systems. Amy reported that she had detected faint, automated signals from some of the closer alien worlds. Defense satellites and monitoring stations were still transmitting basic status reports, but there were no responses to her attempts at communication. It appeared that the evacuation had been thorough and fast. Entire civilizations had packed up and left within hours of receiving the warning about the DVOURERS. Helen made the decision to set course for the nearest major alien world. Kepler Station had been a hub of galactic commerce for over 800 years. If anyone had stayed behind or left information about what was happening, it would be there. The journey would take 4 days at maximum burn, which would strain their fuel reserves, but they needed answers more than they needed efficiency. As the crew prepared for the course change, Jake found himself thinking about humanity's place in this crisis. Every other species in the galaxy had accepted that the Devourers could not be fought. Civilizations that had existed for millions of years and possessed technology that seemed like magic to humans had all reached the same conclusion. Running was the only option, but Jake had studied human history, and he knew that his species had a different approach to impossible situations. When faced with overwhelming odds, humans had a tendency to dig in and fight even when logic suggested they should surrender. Sometimes that stubbornness led to disaster, but sometimes it led to victories that no one had thought possible. The UES Defiance turned toward Kepler Station and accelerated into the darkness. Behind them, the galaxy grew quieter with each passing hour as automated systems failed and the last traces of alien civilization faded away. Ahead of them lay answers that might determine whether humanity would join the exodus to the safe zones or choose a different path entirely. President Lisa Grant stood at the center of the United Earth Council chamber as reports flooded in from every corner of human space. The massive holographic display showed the galaxy in real time with red markers indicating where alien civilizations had gone silent. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Starting from the outer rim and moving inward, the lights of galactic civilization were going out one by one. Admiral Ben Clark stepped forward with a datapad in his hand. His weathered face showed the strain of the past 72 hours since the crisis began. Every ship in the human fleet had been recalled to defensive positions around major colonies and Earth itself. The Admiral had fought in 3 major conflicts during his career, but nothing had prepared him for an enemy that could make entire species disappear overnight. Ben explained that reconnaissance drones had reached 12 major alien worlds in the past day. Every single location was completely abandoned. Space stations drifted empty with their lights still on and their computers still running, but not a single living being remained. The evacuations had been so complete that even pets and livestock were gone. Only the automated defense systems remained, and according to long-range sensors, those were failing one by one as something moved through the galaxy. Dr. Kevin White had been brought to Earth from the UES Defiance to brief the Council on what humanity knew about the Devourers. The scientist looked exhausted from days of research in the deepest archives of human and alien knowledge. Most of the information was fragmentary and came from sources that the alien races themselves seemed reluctant to discuss in detail. Kevin explained that the Devourers existed in a state that was partially outside normal space and time. This made them nearly impossible to detect until they were close enough to begin feeding. They consumed psychic energy and consciousness rather than simple matter, which meant that traditional weapons and defenses were largely useless against them. The entities grew stronger with each mind they devoured and could use that absorbed consciousness to adapt and evolve their tactics. The most disturbing aspect of the devourers was their effect on space itself. Regions where they had fed became dead zones where faster than light travel was impossible. Stars in those areas grew dim and eventually went out entirely. Planets became lifeless rocks floating in empty space. The process was irreversible and seemed to spread outward from wherever the devourers had established a strong presence. General Mike Davis asked the question that everyone in the room was thinking. If civilizations with millions of years of experience and technology far beyond human understanding had all chosen to flee, then what chance did humanity have in a direct fight? The general had spent his entire career preparing for wars against other human factions or alien raiders. Fighting cosmic entities that ate thoughts was so far outside his experience that he barely knew where to begin. Captain Sam Turner joined a meeting via quantum link from the outer colonies where his ship, the UES Vanguard, was investigating refugee reports. Sam had discovered scattered groups of survivors from minor alien species that had been left behind when the major powers evacuated to their safe zones. These refugees told stories that made even experienced soldiers pale with fear. The Skull Traders, who had once raided human shipping lanes, were now broken and desperate. Their homeworlds had been consumed 3 days ago, and the survivors described planets going completely dark in a matter of hours. The nomad engineers who built most of the galaxy's space stations reported that their massive construction ships had simply stopped responding to commands before drifting into empty space. Most terrifying were the reports from species that had tried to fight back. The Metallic Brotherhood had attempted to use their most powerful weapons against the Devourers and had been completely destroyed within minutes. Their war fleets had been found floating dead in space with every crew member missing and their computer systems showing signs of some kind of psychic feedback that had burned out all electronic components. Dr. Rachel Green from the Human Psychic Research Institute presented her analysis of why the alien species had all chosen evacuation over resistance. Most galactic civilizations had evolved beyond the primitive emotions and survival instincts that still drove human behavior. They approached problems with logic and careful analysis, which led them to conclude that retreat was the only rational response to an unbeatable enemy. Humans were different. Rachel explained that humanity had never fully evolved past their aggressive and territorial nature. Where other species saw an unstoppable force of nature that should be avoided, humans saw an enemy that needed to be destroyed. This fundamental difference in thinking might be the key to finding a way to fight the devourers that the other species had missed. The debate in the council chamber grew heated as representatives argued about humanity's response to the crisis. Some called for immediate preparation of evacuation ships to carry human populations to distant galaxies beyond the reach of the Devourers. Others demanded that all resources be focused on building weapons and defenses to protect human worlds from the approaching threat. President Grant listened to all sides before making her decision. Humanity would not run. They would not abandon their homes and their history to hide in some distant corner of the universe. If the galaxy needed someone to stand and fight, then humans would be the ones to do it. The president authorized a full military mobilization and directed all human colonies to begin immediate preparations for war. Admiral Clark began issuing orders to fleet commanders across human space. Every available ship would be armed and equipped for combat. Civilian vessels would be converted to military use and volunteer crews would be recruited from the general population. The admiral knew that most of these ships and their crews would probably be destroyed in the coming fight, but humanity needed every weapon they could find. Dr. White was given unlimited resources and a team of the best scientists humanity could provide. Their mission was to find weaknesses in the Devourers that could be exploited with human technology and tactics. The research would be conducted at facilities on Earth, and the major colonies with all findings shared immediately across the human fleet. General Davis took control of ground-based defenses and began converting human worlds into fortified positions. If the Devourers made it past the fleet, then every planet would become a battlefield. The general started training civilian populations in basic combat techniques and began stockpiling weapons and supplies in underground bunkers. As the meeting ended, President Grant looked out at the stars visible through the chamber's transparent dome. Somewhere out there in the darkness, an ancient enemy was approaching that had already defeated every advanced civilization in the galaxy. Logic suggested that humanity should join the evacuation to the safe zones and wait for the threat to pass, but humans had never been particularly logical when it came to survival. They had a long history of standing and fighting even when the odds were hopeless. Sometimes that stubbornness led to defeat, but sometimes it led to victories that changed the course of history. The president was betting everything on the hope that this would be one of those times when refusing to give up would make all the difference in the galaxy. Engineer Pete Johnson wiped sweat from his forehead as he watched another civilian freighter undergo its transformation in the orbital shipyards above Mars, the massive cargo vessel that had once carried grain and manufactured goods between human colonies was now bristling with weapon systems and armor plating. Pete had been working for 18 hours straight, but the desperate timeline meant there was no time for rest. The conversion process was unlike anything human engineers had attempted before. Every available ship, from tiny personal shuttles to massive industrial haulers, was being turned into a weapon of war. Pete's teams had developed standardized weapon packages that could be installed on almost any vessel. Heavy kinetic cannons replaced cargo loading arms, while missile pods were welded directly onto hull sections. Dr. Nina Bell worked in a laboratory deep beneath the surface of Luna, where she led a team of researchers studying captured alien technology. The goal was to develop defensive systems that could protect human minds from the psychic attacks that the Devourers used to consume consciousness. Nina had discovered that human brains seemed naturally resistant to certain types of mental intrusion, but that resistance needed to be amplified and weaponized. The breakthrough came when Nina realized that human emotional responses actually strengthened their psychic defenses. Fear, anger, and determination created a kind of mental static that made it harder for external forces to penetrate human thoughts. Her team began developing helmet devices that could amplify and focus these emotional states to create protective barriers around the wearer's mind. Captain Alex Stone stood on the bridge of his converted cargo hauler, the New Boston, as his volunteer crew ran through combat drills for the 15th time that day. None of these people were professional soldiers. His gunner had been a school teacher before the crisis began, while his navigator had worked as a mining engineer on the asteroid colonies. They all knew the odds of survival were practically zero, but they had volunteered anyway. Alex had seen the same determination on every ship in the growing human fleet. Farmers, mechanics, shop owners, and office workers had all stepped forward when the call went out for volunteers. They left behind families and careers to cruise ships that were barely more than armed cargo containers. The human military simply did not have enough trained personnel to operate the thousands of vessels being converted for combat. Colonel Frank Reed supervised weapons testing at the military research facility on Titan, where captured alien equipment was being studied and reverse engineered. Most of the advanced energy weapons that other species used proved completely ineffective against devourer entities. The exotic particles and force fields that made these weapons so powerful in normal combat seemed to pass harmlessly through creatures that existed partially outside regular space. Frank's team made a disturbing discovery when they tested simple human weapons against samples of devourer material recovered from the outer rim. Basic kinetic weapons, like bullets and missiles, could actually damage the entities, while sophisticated alien technology had no effect at all. The reason seemed to be connected to the intent and emotion that humans put into their weapon designs. Human weapons were created with the specific purpose of killing living beings. Every bullet was designed to cause maximum damage to flesh and bone, while every missile was built to destroy and eliminate targets. That focused intent to cause harm somehow made the weapons effective against creatures that fed on consciousness and thought. The more violent and aggressive the weapon's design, the more damage it could inflict on the devourers. Lieutenant Maya Davis worked with a team of military historians to study human warfare tactics that might be applicable to fighting an enemy unlike anything the galaxy had ever faced. Maya discovered that many strategies developed during Earth's bloodiest conflicts could be adapted for use against the Devourers. Surprise attacks, coordinated strikes, and the willingness to accept heavy casualties in order to achieve objectives were all concepts that alien civilizations had abandoned. Long ago, the alien species had fought their wars with careful planning and minimal loss of life. They used technology to minimize risk and always sought the most efficient path to victory. Humans still retained the primitive willingness to throw themselves into hopeless battles if it meant protecting something they valued. That savage determination might be exactly what was needed to fight an enemy that consumed entire civilizations. Maya's research revealed that humans had a unique approach to impossible situations. Where other species would calculate odds and retreat when defeat seemed certain, humans had a history of fighting even harder when things looked hopeless. The concept of a last stand where soldiers fought to the death rather than surrender was something that most alien cultures could not understand or appreciate. Dr. Chris Allen worked on the most ambitious project of all in a secret facility hidden in the asteroid belt. His team was attempting to weaponize human emotion itself by creating devices that could channel and focus the raw fury and determination that seemed to be humanity's greatest strength. The Fury Cores, as they were called, would theoretically be able to disrupt devourer feeding patterns and potentially even damage the entities directly. The science behind the Fury Cores was barely understood even by the humans who were building them. The devices seemed to work by concentrating human thoughts and emotions into a focused beam of psychic energy. When activated by someone experiencing intense anger or determination, the cores could apparently create distortions in space-time that affected creatures existing between dimensions. Testing of the prototype Fury Cores had produced mixed results. Some devices had no effect at all, while others had created explosions that destroyed entire research facilities. The key seemed to be finding humans who could maintain the necessary emotional intensity while operating the controls. Soldiers who had lost family members to the advancing Devourers proved to be the most effective operators. General Mike Davis coordinated the massive mobilization effort from his command center on Earth, where screens showed the progress of ship conversions and crew training across human space. The general had calculated that humanity would be able to field approximately 12,000 combat vessels when the preparations were complete. Most of these ships would be inferior to proper military vessels, but they would carry crews motivated by something the galaxy had not seen in millions of years. The timeline was becoming critical as reports arrived of Devourer activity moving closer to human space. Outer Rim monitoring stations had detected the characteristic dead zones that marked areas where the entities had fed. Entire star systems were going dark as the ancient enemy advanced toward the core worlds where most of humanity's population lived. Operation Last Stand was scheduled to launch in 72 hours when the conversion process would be complete and all available crews would be ready for combat. The plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. Every human ship would advance directly toward the strongest concentration of Devourer entities and engage them in battle using weapons and tactics that no other species had been willing to attempt. Admiral Clark knew that most of the fleet would be destroyed in the opening phases of the battle, but the goal was not to win a conventional victory. The objective was to prove that the Devourers could be hurt and potentially even defeated by a species that refused to accept the logical conclusion that resistance was futile. If humanity could inflict any damage at all on the ancient enemy, it might encourage other species to emerge from their safe zones and join the fight. Admiral Tony Rivera stood on the bridge of the UES Liberty as the largest human fleet in history emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Nexus sector. 12,000 ships of every size and description dropped back into normal space in a coordinated formation that stretched across millions of kilometers. From massive converted cargo haulers to tiny fighters built in garage workshops, every vessel carried crews who knew they were probably flying to their deaths. The sight that greeted them was beyond anything the human imagination had prepared for. The Devourers filled the space between star systems like a living darkness that seemed to absorb light itself. The entities appeared as massive shifting forms that constantly changed shape and size. Some looked like clouds of black smoke, while others resembled geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. They moved through space without any visible means of propulsion and seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. Captain Donna Clark commanded a squadron of converted mining ships that had been equipped with kinetic bombardment systems. Her crews were mostly former asteroid miners who understood how to use heavy equipment in dangerous conditions. Donna had lost her home colony to the Devourers 3 days earlier, and the rage that burned inside her made her one of the most effective Fury Core operators in the fleet. The first phase of the battle began when the human fleet opened fire at maximum range, using every conventional weapon in their arsenal. Energy beams and missile salvos that could have destroyed entire planets passed harmlessly through the Devourer entities without causing any visible damage. The ancient creatures seemed completely immune to the advanced weapons that other galactic civilizations had relied on. For millions of years, Tony ordered the fleet to advance to close range where the kinetic weapons and experimental human technology could be brought to bear. The movement brought the human ships directly into contact with smaller Devourer entities that swarmed around the larger forms like parasites. These creatures were roughly the size of fighter craft, but moved in ways that defied physics by phasing in and out of normal space. Commander Greg Walsh led the first boarding parties against derelict alien vessels that had been invaded by Devourer spawn. His teams carried simple projectile weapons and wore the prototype psychic shielding helmets that Dr. Nina Bell had developed. The fighting inside the abandoned ships was unlike anything human soldiers had ever experienced, as they battled creatures that could partially materialize through solid walls. The boarding parties discovered that human weapons were indeed effective against the Devourer spawn, but only when fired by someone experiencing intense emotion. Soldiers who remained calm and professional found their bullets passing harmlessly through the entities, while those who fought with fury and desperation could inflict real damage. Greg quickly adapted his tactics to encourage his troops to channel their anger and fear into their combat effectiveness. Dr. Chris Allen monitored the first combat test of the Fury Cores from his position aboard a command ship positioned safely behind the main battle line. The experimental weapons were mounted on volunteer vessels crewed by humans who had lost everything to the Devourer advance. When the cores were activated, they created visible distortions in space that seemed to cause the larger entities significant discomfort. The breakthrough came when Lieutenant Sue Parker volunteered to pilot her fighter directly into the center of a major Devourer entity while carrying an overloaded Fury core. Sue had watched her entire family die when the creatures consumed her home world, and the combination of grief and rage made her the perfect operator for the experimental weapon. Her ship disappeared into the shifting darkness of the entity, and for several minutes there was no sign of what was happening inside. The explosion when the Fury core detonated was visible across the entire battlefield. The Devourer entity that had engulfed Sue's fighter convulsed and began to break apart as waves of psychic energy tore through its non-physical form. For the first time since the entities had appeared at the edge of the galaxy, one of them had been visibly damaged by weapons created by a younger species. The success of Sue's sacrifice inspired other volunteer pilots to attempt similar attacks using overloaded Fury cores and pure kamikaze determination. Human fighters and small ships began diving directly into Devourer entities while broadcasting messages of defiance and fury. Each successful attack weakened the creatures and proved that they were not the unstoppable force that the galaxy had believed them to be. Captain Alex Stone found himself commanding a group of converted freighters in a desperate battle against Devourer spawn that had broken through the main defensive line. His crews included teachers, farmers, and mechanics who had never fired a weapon in anger, but who fought with a ferocity that surprised even themselves. Alex realized that the human capacity for violence that other species found disturbing was exactly what was needed in this fight. The tide of battle began to shift as human forces adapted their tactics to take advantage of their unique strengths. Ships that would have been considered obsolete by galactic standards proved effective when crewed by humans who refused to acknowledge that they were outgunned. Volunteer pilots flew suicide missions with enthusiasm that would have horrified more civilized species. Tony coordinated the fleet's movements from his command position while monitoring reports from across the battlefield. Human losses were severe, with entire squadrons being destroyed in minutes, but the Devourers were taking damage for the first time in their ancient existence. The entities seemed confused by prey that fought back instead of running and their feeding. Patterns were being disrupted by the constant attacks. The most significant discovery came when Dr. Allen analyzed the psychic readings from successful Fury core detonations. The weapons were not just damaging individual Devourer entities, but were actually poisoning the creatures from within. Human emotions of defiance and determination seemed to be toxic to beings that fed on despair and submission. Every human who died fighting instead of fleeing made the entities slightly weaker. Commander Walsh reported from the boarding actions that Devourer spawn were beginning to retreat from human ships rather than attempting to feed on the crews. The creatures seemed to have learned that humans were not the helpless prey they had expected. Instead of providing nourishment, human consciousness appeared to cause them something resembling indigestion or pain. The battle reached its climax when a coordinated attack by 50 volunteer pilots successfully destroyed one of the largest Devourer entities in the sector. The massive creature that had been consuming entire star systems was torn apart by focused Fury core explosions and the raw fury of humans who refused to accept defeat. The destruction of such a powerful entity sent shock waves through the Devourer forces and caused many of them to begin withdrawing toward the galactic rim. As the immediate battle ended, Tony surveyed the cost of humanity's first victory against the ancient enemy. Nearly half the human fleet had been destroyed, and thousands of volunteers had given their lives to prove that the Devourers could be defeated. But the survivors had accomplished something that no other species in galactic history had managed. They had forced beings that existed beyond normal space and time to retreat from a fight. The message was transmitted immediately to every corner of the galaxy where the remaining civilizations hid in their safe zone dimensions. Humanity had found a way to hurt the Devourers and was willing to continue fighting no matter what the cost. The question now was whether other species would emerge from hiding to join the battle, or if humans would have to finish the fight alone. Captain Rick Foster looked out at the swirling darkness that surrounded the galactic core as the UES Endurance and the last remnants of the human fleet approached their final destination. Only 300 ships remained from the 12,000 that had begun Operation Last Stand 2 weeks earlier. The survivors were battle-scarred and running low on ammunition, but they carried with them something more valuable than weapons. They carried the knowledge that the Devourers could be beaten. The space around the galactic core was unlike anything human science had ever recorded. The massive black hole that held the galaxy together was being slowly consumed by Devourer entities so large that they defied measurement. These ancient creatures had wrapped themselves around the gravitational center of the galaxy and were feeding on the fundamental forces that kept billions of star systems in stable orbits. Dr. Lavra Miller was the only scientist left alive from the original research team that had developed the Fury core technology. She worked frantically in the Endurance's converted laboratory to prepare the final weapon that humanity would use against the Devourers. The device was larger than anything they had built before and would require the complete destruction of the ship to activate properly. Lavra had discovered that every human death in battle against the Devourers weakened the entities in ways that normal weapons could not achieve. The creatures fed on consciousness, but human consciousness was fundamentally different from that of other species. Where alien minds provided nourishment to the Devourers, human thoughts seemed to poison them from within. The final Fury core would amplify this effect using the combined will of every remaining human in the fleet. Rick received a quantum transmission from the hidden monitoring stations that the evacuated alien civilizations had established to observe the conflict. The Ethereal Collective and the Crystalline Hive were watching from their safe zone, dimensions as humanity made its last desperate attack against enemies that had terrified the galaxy for millions of years. The alien observers could barely believe what they were seeing. For the first time in recorded galactic history, the Devourers were actually retreating from a fight. The ancient entities that had consumed entire galactic clusters were being forced back by a species that most civilizations had considered primitive and violent. The human approach to warfare that emphasized sacrifice and determination over logic and efficiency had proven effective against enemies that existed beyond normal space and time. Commander Amy Carter coordinated communications between the surviving human ships as they prepared for the final assault. Each vessel carried volunteers who understood that this mission would end in their deaths, but who had chosen to continue fighting rather than retreat to safety. The crews included the last survivors from dozens of human colonies that had been destroyed during the Devourer advance, the alien refugees who had been rescued by human ships during the early stages of the conflict watched in amazement as their saviors prepared to sacrifice themselves for a galaxy that had abandoned them. The Skull Traders and Nomad Engineers had seen their own civilizations flee rather than fight, but humans were choosing to die rather than surrender even. A single star system to the ancient enemy. Rick gave the order to begin the final attack as the human fleet advanced directly toward the largest concentration of Devourer entities surrounding the galactic core. The creatures had grown massive from feeding on the black hole's energy, but they seemed confused and disoriented by the approaching human ships. The Devourers had never encountered prey that actively sought them. Out for battle, the fighting was intense and desperate as human ships engaged Devourer entities in close combat around the event horizon of the galactic black hole. Converted cargo vessels and improvised fighters attacked creatures the size of moons using weapons that should have been completely ineffective. But human determination and fury made the impossible weapons work where sophisticated alien technology had failed. Captain Foster watched his fleet being destroyed ship by ship as they fought their way closer to the primary Devourer entity that had wrapped itself around the black hole. Each human death sent waves of psychic energy through the creature that caused visible distortions in its non-physical form. The entity was being poisoned by the consciousness of beings who refused to accept defeat, even in the face of certain death. Miller completed the final calculations for the Master Fury core and transmitted the activation codes to every surviving human ship. The device would channel the dying thoughts of every crew member into a concentrated beam of pure human defiance that would be fired directly into the heart of the primary Devourer. The weapon would only work if activated by someone experiencing the ultimate human emotion of sacrificial rage. The moment came when Rick made the decision that would determine the fate of the galaxy. The Endurance was the last human ship still capable of carrying the Master Fury core to its target, and Rick was the only person left with the command codes needed to activate it. He set course directly for the primary Devourer entity while broadcasting humanity's final message to the hidden alien civilizations. Rick's transmission was simple and direct in the way that had always characterized human communication, he told the galaxy that humans did not give up, and they did not back down, and they sure as hell did not run from a fight. The Devourers had made the mistake of threatening humanity's home, and now they would learn why other species found human violence so disturbing. The Endurance flew directly into the primary Devourer entity as Rick activated the Master Fury core. With his final breath, the explosion that followed was visible across the entire galaxy as concentrated human consciousness tore through the ancient creature like acid through flesh. The entity that had existed since before the birth of most star systems was destroyed by the focused fury of a species that refused to be prey. The death of the primary Devourer sent shock waves through the remaining entities that caused them to break apart and flee back toward the void beyond the galactic rim. The creatures that had consumed countless civilizations were retreating from a galaxy defended by beings they could not understand or digest. Human consciousness had proven to be toxic to creatures that fed on despair and submission. The alien civilizations emerged from their safe zone dimensions to find a galaxy scarred by battle, but free from the ancient threat that had terrified them for millions of years. The monitoring stations recorded the final moments of the human fleet and transmitted the data to every species that had fled rather than fight. Humanity had saved the galaxy by refusing to accept that some enemies could not be defeated. The memorial wall built on New Earth after the war listed the names of every human who had died fighting the Devourers. The inscription carved into the black stone was simple and reflected the spirit that had driven humanity to victory against impossible odds. It read that they were told to run but chose to fight, and the galaxy was free. Because humanity had loaded its guns, the galaxy learned that sometimes the wrong choice according to logic and reason could become the right choice when everyone else had given up hope. Humanity's primitive refusal to surrender had saved civilizations that were millions of years older and far more advanced. The species that other races had considered violent and unreasonable had proven that some things were worth fighting for no matter what the cost. In the years that followed the Devourer War, the galaxy rebuilt itself with a new understanding of what courage really meant. The alien civilizations that had fled to safety worked alongside humans to repair the damage and ensure that such a threat could never again force the galaxy to choose between fighting and running, but everyone knew that if such a choice ever came again, humanity would load its guns and stand ready to fight.